Welcome back. My guest is Gordon Stewart, president of the Insurance Information Institute. Gordon, welcome.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to have your own TV show as you do, and nice to be an early guest.
Tell me a little bit about III.
Well, we are the principal means by which the industry's substance and views are known to people around the world. We have just about every news outlet in the world inquiring about insurance information. We deal with millions of people directly over the web and through helplines and other things. And we are the principal provider of information to the outside world.
When you say the principal provider, there's so many different sources of information today about insurance and other industries. Do you focus what you provide on a daily basis, or do you cover the entire spectrum of information that might go on a daily basis?
Well, the entire spectrum, but to define the audience more carefully, let's say there are probably 2 million people, give or take, in the United States who work in insurance. That means there are at least 250 million people who don't. Our primary audience is everybody else. And there are a lot more of everybody else than there are people who work in insurance.
Okay. Public perception of the insurance industry has really not been well through the years, and when hurricanes come in or any natural disaster, it seems to peak. How do you deal with this? I mean, is it getting any better, or is it something we just need to deal with and contend with your role as III?
Well, thanks. And this is not a setup, by the way, but you asked a favorite question. Okay.
Why should I be a member of III? Right?
Okay. Favorite question. Here's why. One of all industries, all worlds, all cultures, all civilizations, all countries have their internal myths, articles of faith, things they deeply believe to be true. Axioms. They're called axioms because they've never generally been questioned as to whether or not they are in fact the case. One of them that continues to, I'm very fond of it in the insurance industry, is the idea that we are somehow universally disliked, number one, and two, that that's a state of nature. That we are highly disliked, and we've always been so, and there's probably nothing we can do about it.
But don't they do surveys?
Yes.
Like used car salesmen in insurance?
They being we do. And here's where it gets interesting. Okay, III has been surveying the American folks since 1968. It's one of the things I wanted to continue when I took over III, because it's a very basic survey. Asks the same questions of the same sample. So you have something useful. And it's not a loaded set of questions. It simply asks the respondents to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 their views of favorable to unfavorable of various industries. The same industries, by the way. Although we did add health as a separate category. But it's things like electric, power, banking, blah, blah, blah. And this has been going on since 1968. Guess what? You do not see a constant low rating for insurance. Or, for that matter, any other of the sampled industries. They all fluctuate and go up and down over a fairly wide range over periods of time, depending on things that they do or do not do.
Like petroleum today?
Exactly. There was a point, the low point for insurance, and a surrogate for this in property casualty would be auto and homeowners, was in the early 80s, late 70s, when we hit our all-time low around 32-33%. And there we weren't much different from consumer finance companies, loan sharks, and whatever.
Better than the president today.
That's true. We almost even then had ratings that were comparable. Now we have ratings he would envy. We began a fairly slow but quite steady and now very sustained climb out from that position in the 90s, and we have been for the last 5 or 6 years somewhere between 55 and 60%.
Impressive.
Yeah, and when we first hit 60, I went back and had the survey done 3 times before releasing the lowest of the three numbers, because I didn't want people to think that this was somehow being manipulated or be stuck with a fluke, that then when it fell off, people say, hey, what's going on here? Fact is, approval is not a state of nature. It is not inherent in insurance. I used to hear the stuff that people said, well, it doesn't matter what happens. People are always going to hate us because they have to pay us money for a product, and the only time that they come in contact is when they have to use it, when something bad's happen, so it really doesn't matter. We're always going to be popular. Nobody likes it. In a way, there are a lot of people in insurance who still believe this. I've come to think they like to believe this. Somehow, in some kind of weird, sad-sacky way, they have become attached to this belief about themselves that they're publicly loathed. It maybe even makes them feel better, and maybe give them some sense of distinction. But they kind of schlep around with this hangdog look, like everybody hates us, doesn't matter what we do, nothing will affect that. None of these things are true. They're all objectively false. There are people who in insurance who come to understand this, and they've seen these numbers, but over and over and over again, and if I did one thing this morning, this afternoon, whenever people are watching this, try to get through to folks in insurance that your relationship to the public is not a state of nature, it is not inherent in what you do, and it is very affected by what you do, how you do it, and how that is explained to people.
But you still need to deal with the media.
We do.
Obviously, they seem to be the ones that filter and channel information to the world. Right. So how have you changed what you have been doing over the past couple of decades at III to deal with?
Well, that's a very important dimension of III's refocusing for a time, and now refocusing. When I came into III, it was probably at the height of the media's control of how information reached the public. If we think back now,
90? Was that 90?
Yeah, around that. If we think back to those old days, we remember when there were 3 networks. And everybody in politics, everybody in government, this was true when I was in the White House, you would all gather around at 6 o'clock and you would see what Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, and what was his name, Sam Donaldson, all these people were going to say about you, because that's what the country was going to know about you, and that's what people were going to think about it. And almost everybody, politicians, businesses, you name it, were focused on these 3, or maybe the New York Times and the Washington Post, as a key group of media, because it was a tiny little narrow funnel through which almost all perceptions were disseminated. And so enormous industries grew up designed to influence that particular nexus of, and everybody knew who they were. Not long after that, you saw the rise of all these investigative shows. If you remember, there was a time when there were 10 of them on a week. There was 60 Minutes 1, 2, and 3. There was 2020. There was this one, that one, and they were all looking into stuff. And this was the dominant media. So what did we do at III? We said, okay, if this is the way that most people are going to get their sense of the world and what's going on, and this is what we'll focus on. And so we made it our business, our obsession to get to know these folks. And our mission, or our main operating instruction that we set, our goal is no story is going to be written by these folks that they don't talk to us and don't know who we are. So we focused intently on those, and that was one of the factors that led to the rise in public perception. Since then, we now see the rise of the information age, and a flow in exactly the opposite direction. And we've seen an erosion and whatever you want to call it, diffusion of these people's ability to now, if you go around and ask people to name even the anchors of the big shows, they probably couldn't even tell you. These other shows have disappeared. The big papers don't have the same influence. There has been a great dispersal of sources and avenues of information. The Internet also allows you to do one vital thing. It frees you from the tyranny of any medium and any intermediary. Not a medium, it is a medium, but an intermediary. You can get information directly. One of the things that's meant for III is that we've invested enormously in our web capability, and we are listed 1, 2, or 3 on, say, the Google search engine. If you just type in the word insurance, nothing else, we will come up 1, 2, or 3 out of hundreds of millions of possible entries. If you occupy that position, then the networks really have less direct influence on perception, because when people have a question about anything, what's the first thing they do now?
Google it.
Google it. They don't wait for the CBS evening news. They go, and there it is. And if you come up 1, 2, or 3 and you give people what they're looking for, they have no incentive to go to page 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So this has given us, for the first time, an ability to influence people's understanding of us directly as an organization to the person themselves, without the filter and the intermediation of some media personality. So we now have 2 basic channels of information. If you look at the website, you'll see it's divided immediately into media on one side and what we call individuals, because we think of consumers as a kind of patronizing term. And the traffic is about 50-50. So people don't need to go through a newspaper to learn things about insurance. And this has increased our ability to influence what people know about insurance and what they feel about the industry.
Politicians still seem to focus on a news cycle, and they start with the Sunday morning shows and so forth. You seem to be saying the news cycle is dead?
No, but the news cycle is much less of a monopoly. It used to be the only thing. The news cycle was a kind of Manichaean, rigid thing that you couldn't break out of. Now that it is only one of several things that politicians focus on. And the media is quite aware of that. It used to be, and again, this back to the old White House days, that daily briefing that went on in the press room was the whole show. Now, something happens, and they're seeding the blog sphere. They're seeding stuff in there with their commentators that go out into the. And by the time people even turn on the radio to listen to the commentator, the views on this thing are already flying around over the internet, and the internet carries the visual information that television does. So every year that goes by weakens the hold of central media around the world.
Doesn't that allow the weekly publications or the monthly publications to provide consumers with much more perspective on issues, because there's so much white noise on a daily basis of all this news coming at
Sure, it does. It does. It also, one of the things it's done, interestingly, is strengthen, I think, the position of local papers. You would think
it strengthens it.
Yeah, because the first thing that people want to read about or hear about or see is stuff that's closest to home.
Sure.
There's a funny behavioral experiment that's done in the media. If you dump 3 papers on somebody's doorstep in the afternoon, and one is one of the big nationals, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the other is the Daily Toledan or whatever, and the third is the neighborhood Blatt, that's what they'll read first, because their dog's in it or their kid is in a high school football team. So it will tend to start, and the internet, it makes this even more possible because you can slice and dice it even more accurate. But what that has done is actually help the local papers, many of whom were hooked up with their own little website. So if you want to know, it used to be you waited until Friday to see who won, or Monday or whatever, to won the high school football game. Now you can follow the high school football game on the Daily Bugle's own website. And you can read about your kid's achievement or whatever right there. So it's strengthened local media, which makes our job even more interesting because, and hurricane's a good example, if you were to see a list of the local media in Mississippi or Louisiana, some of these are just wonderful. I mean, Faulkner could not have made up these names. There are hundreds of them. But they are the principal means by which people get local information. They're not turning on CBS or NBC, sorry fellas, to hear what's going on in Biloxi. They've got all this stuff there, and it's interface between local media and between print media, TV, and the web. And this is an opportunity for III, because this is all we do all day, is pump out information to different outlets and directly to individuals to maintain a flow of free and open and accurate information.
You've got economists on staff.
We do.
Is that because the networks or the news services use you as expert source of information on rates and what have you?
You bet. One of the interesting things about the rise of the information age is the shift in power, if you will, from the commentator to the provider of content. Since there's so many channels open, that you stand or fall now by how good your content is, how credible it is, how accurate, how useful, and content really is getting its power back. There was a time when the funnel was very narrow, and you had all these people with content competing for the attention to get into this tiny little pipe. Then content mattered less than your ability to maneuver it through the pipe. Now the pipe is wide open everywhere. So what you have to offer and the quality of it is going to determine how much it's used. For example, there are newspaper libraries that link, for their reporters, that will link directly to III because of the quality of the content. And so I found that the direction we needed to go the most in was to strengthen our ability to provide the highest possible quality, credible content, which is the thing that influences reputation as much as anything else. If you tell people stuff that isn't true, if you try to spin stuff, if you try to puff your stuff up, this will not work. It will fail over some period of time. Sooner or later, it will first sag and then it will collapse.
Well, you've got a great reputation, and obviously the press views the Institute as a terrific source of information. When we come back, I want to talk to you about your days before you reached III, because I think they're equally interesting. We'll be back in just a moment.
Want to know the hottest IT trends and how they impact the industry and your job? Tune into Tech Talk here on ACORD TV.
ACORD, not only a source, but a resource.
We're back with my guest, Gordon Stewart. Gordon, prior to your joining the Insurance Information Institute, I see you were with the American Stock Exchange. You were deputy chief speechwriter to President Jimmy Carter and speechwriter for Mayor Lindsay in New York City, and it goes on and on and on. How did you make the transition from that to where you are now? And we'll talk a little bit about your life pre-III.
Ouch. Yeah, that's the hard part. First of all, it's too late to do anything about that now. I mean, it's all done. So I gotten away with a whole lot. I wouldn't suggest to young people listening that they try to pull this thing off at home. Maybe I was just demographically blessed. At the time I got into the game, it was just before the baby boom. So there weren't that many of me out there. So I could kind of, try to get away with almost anything I could convince other people that I could do. And I guess if you look for the common thread, it's sort of megalomania in search of an occupation. And so you keep groping around, you find something you can get away with and do. And they've all been interesting. I began as a Amherst College professor, traits that I probably retain to some extent to this day. Was in New York directing plays. I went through Yale Drama School as a director, but also graduate schools in history and music, and I'm a failed conductor as well.
You were the original director.
I directed the first production of Elephant Man, which was the last of about 30, 35 plays, but there were world premieres of plays by Sam Shepard and Jack Gelber and a bunch of other characters, and did a lot of that. Worked in Hollywood for a while.
I guess the sense I'm getting a sense of the world as a stage for
well, it never quite got away with it on the level that I would like to, but there were moments. For example, when we signed the SALT II treaty with the Soviet Union, which set the limits on weapons of mass destruction, that was the outer range which they ever reached, and it only went down from there. We signed that treaty on the stage in Vienna in the small theater where I had directed student productions. Now, I obviously didn't write the SALT II treaty, but helped sell it and pull it together. So there are times in which these things come together, and I find kind of drawing on all of this in some strange and unpredictable way helps. We do a lot of work in Europe and other places, and one of the graduate degrees was in what went on in the 30 Years' War and the origins of World War I, and so these are things that I find I use.
But what's it like to be a speechwriter for a president of the United States? I mean, putting words on paper for them to read off teleprompters or what have you? Is it burning the midnight oil and they come in and redline it for me? How?
It varies enormously by the individuals involved in the administration. There's a little club called the Judson Welliver Society that Bill Sapphire started on the Secretary of Bills of the President, and it consists of the 3 or 4 principal speechwriters from each administration, going back to Truman. It's wonderful. It's folks like Sorensen and Arthur Schlesinger and Pat Buchanan and Peggy Noonan and Chris Matthews and Rick Hertzberg and others, and we sort of trade stories about this. It's become, over the years, inevitably more outwardly directed in some ways because there's so much testing that can go on and so many ways of finding out which words resonate well and what kind of phrases, if you use these phrases.
Process
well, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. It varies enormously by administration and by time.
Well, does Carter ever give a speech that you sit there and cringe that he used a certain sentence or word and say,
Well, President Carter is each president has his own approach to dealing with this. Roosevelt had his, and they all deal with this essentially unnatural activity. Until it spilled down into the corporate world, I think this is the only case where a major leader was saying things that person didn't actually write. And that was not always the way it was done. No one suggests, for example, that Lincoln's second inaugural, when you read it up there, was actually written by a guy named Hiram Smith, who was hiding out in Ohio somewhere. At some point in the 1920s, this strange convention of presidents giving words written by somebody else took over. So each president has had to find their own way to come to terms with this. In the case of President Carter, he never fundamentally cared for the fact of it. President Carter, as you know, is someone who does his own work. If it's building,
so you're not responsible for the fireside chats and the rocking chair and the sweaters?
It'd be hard to call that responsible because until he became president, or was about to become president, until he was a Democratic nominee, I don't think President Carter had delivered words written for him by another individual. And I can tell you this, following the farewell address, which I did have some hand in, he never did it again. He writes his own books, and he did call me a while ago, and he had to do a political speech in behalf of Kerry, and he was looking for a little assistance with that, and having written, I think, 2 volumes of poetry, 3 novels, 14 other books, I was able to say, well, of course I'm happy to help, but I'm not exactly flattered that you're only turning to me for the lower forms of literature now. Political speeches is all that's left. So he was a very unique one. The relationship that the current President Bush has with Michael Gerson, the speechwriter, is a very unusual one. Here you have Gerson as a person of great eloquence, highly educated, literate type, and in deep personal religious convictions, and the president is not someone who I think even his most ardent supporters would say is an avid a student of the upper reaches of English literature, and yet the two of them find their own way with each other. And if you look at the characters that have done this, whether it's Peggy Noonan and others with Ronald Reagan, one of the people that was in our White House, you can imagine this actually working for me, is Chris Matthews. I mean, imagine, and that's, talk about a fiction. Chris is very much himself.
Chris Matthews used to work for...
Yeah, Chris Matthews was a speechwriter for President Carter. And so nominally, at one point, I was, I guess, supposed to have supervised Chris Matthews, which is just a ludicrous concept. There it is. So each of these strange, they're each strange in their own way, whereas other staff functions within White Houses more or less have a system to it. The National Security Advisor is National Security. The Secretary of Energy, worries about energy and stuff. The speechwriter function and relationships are all different because they are fundamentally unnatural and imposed by the extraordinary demands of the office and its need for public utterances. So they're all idiosyncratic, individual, and deeply personal. And I will say this, it's a very moving experience to have, there was not a moment that I was not fully engaged and humbled and completely overcome with this. Plus the fact that we had manual typewriters.
Yeah.
So what we wrote at a certain point was very difficult to undo because there wasn't time,
Right.
and the Air Force One was below 10,000 feet, and at that point in those days, the phones would cut off.
Mm-hmm.
So it was you really did have a certain sense of responsibility. At the very least, you didn't want the poor man who had the much more difficult job of being President of the United States to be embarrassed, humiliated, and undercut by the mediocrity of your own efforts.
Gordon, it seems like your earlier life prepared you quite well for the life you lead today at III, and we appreciate the work that you're doing for us as an industry and for the general public. Thank you very much for being here today.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. It's great that you have your own show. I mean, this is very impressive.